Hello friends, we are running a series, as you know, of on the 20th century poetry, and today's discussion would be on the famous American poet Robert Frost, who is known for his short poems and who actually is the voice of sanity in the present day world. And he was called a kind of genius of a different kind. He believed in simplicity, he believed in short statement. He would not use any flowery language, or he would just say things very simply, but suddenly those things that he said became metaphors. So for such a great poet of the 20th century American literature, we have Dr. Richa Bajaj, who is Associate Professor at Delhi University in Hindu College, and she will be today initiating the discussion, making some points, and she will be sharing those points with you in the critical sense. She might also raise questions about Robert Frost. She might tell you what message he gives and all. So now I request Professor Bajaj to take over and begin her lecture.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Yes, we'll be discussing today the poetry of Robert Frost. The time period of Robert Frost is from 1874 to 1963. So you can clearly call him a modern poet, but whether you can call him a modernist poet or not, we'll see in the course of our discussion. Yes, it is also true that Robert Frost was witness to this kind of change, this rapid sort of industrialization that occurred in America. He was also witness to the war periods. So in a way, these remain in the backdrop, but you seldom find Robert Frost taking these up directly for projection in his poetry. So his poetry is actually more in line with Emerson, but then breaks away from Emerson because it doesn't necessarily talks about the healing aspects of nature. In fact, it talks about nature, processes of nature, the cycle of life and death in very violent, brutal terms as well. So nature is as terrifying for Robert Frost as it is joyous, so there is this kind of variety in his poetry with respect to nature. Often he is also referred to as a poet of rural life, or not so much nature poet, but poet who deals with the rustic folks. Also this other side of New England, which is I'm of course referring to New England in America, where you saw writers take up there was one, of course, industrialization and Yale and Harvard sort of being set up and all of that. But on the other hand, there was this other side of, that the country, the region that belonged to people on the farmlands who worked, in the heart of the woods. So Robert Frost is often known to be a very distinctly American poet because he takes into focus this other group of people, the ones who belong to the country life, so he is in that sense viewed as this kind of a poet. But we try and expand our discussion on Robert Frost and see if we can also see him as a poet who's maybe political, because that's not something you associate him with, but we'll also look at how he foregrounds the ethic of labor. So I think in that is his value, and he immediately an emotion, a feeling is personal, but at the same time universal. And in many ways I feel that Robert Frost also rejects the whole idea of futility, because the moment there is a moment of absurdity, of futility of life, or he's taken to the dark forces and the darker aspects rule his poems, he immediately moves out of them and also takes you towards a kind of reassertion of life. So I think there is I don't see him as, to begin with, I'd say I don't see him as a modernist poet, because you see, if you notice that this is the period when Eliot and Pound were becoming famous, and this is also the period during he's the contemporary of Yeats, Eliot, Pound, and yet he's very distinct and very unlike them, because he doesn't indulge in this kind of selfhood, and he doesn't indulge in this kind of futility of life, or say to discuss the the mundane aspects as just a kind of a cross that one is bearing. So suffering it's not suffering in Robert Frost. While it is suffering for the modernist poets in Europe, it is not suffering for Robert Frost. I'd use the word endurance for him, and I think that is what sets him apart. How do you look at these two words, endurance and suffering?
Yes, that's right, because even though he is born, as you rightly say, in the modernist times, he is not a modernist at all. And in fact, he is away from the city, he is away from that kind of supposedly developed culture, and he belongs to the village, and perhaps the sensibility is peasant. I think he is closer, if one is to think about the likeness of his voice with others, closer to Tolstoy, and they were contemporaries. And he straddles both the centuries, the 19th and the 20th. He doesn't take any conservative stand on things as some of the 19th century people did, but he belongs there in the sense that he believes in sedateness, he believes in quiet wisdom, he doesn't want to make a flashy statement, and yet he is a modern poet in the sense that he actually responds to the 20th century America in the suburban part, in the small town part, not in the urban centers.
Right.
So that's how.
Also, so therefore, also there is a complete sort of indifference to, or a complete erasure of industrialized America. The kind of stark reality that you see this life is for a lot of people, you find that that's not the case in Frost. In fact, to some extent, I feel that poetry in the 20th century, the early 20th century, in America is that way different from the kind of poetry that is getting written in England.
I like your word endurance, because he wants to say things that will last for quite some time, that will leave an impact on people's imagination and sensibility.
Yeah, but also endurance coming from the fact that we are still looking at the place which is known for its work ethic, stoicism, how that particular region was founded in the first place, because they rejected luxury and idleness, and they moved to this region to create a kind of a society based on hard work. So I think the Puritan ethic on which it was based, on which this society is based in America, it sort of is carried forward in the generations to come, and I thought about it, and I thought that is what sets it apart from the elitist groups in England. What do you have to say to that?
That's very true, because he doesn't belong to the elitist world, to the world of fashion, to the world of beginning commercialism. He wants to keep himself away from all this.
Yes.
And yet he says through simple things something that will make you like the America of the hinterland, not
right.
the America of the city. So that way I think his effect will endure through the 20th century, and even today he is a poet of great appeal.
Right, and maybe that's why he is also liked a lot, because of his mass reach, because he's not just talking about an elitist group, but rather talking about the masses who are scattered all over the country and often lived in remote corners in America. So I think that has a lot to do with this kind of appeal that Frost had in his own country, and how he turned into this kind of a poet laureate, almost as sort of a national poet of America in the 20th century. So yes, I think that's how I'd like to place Frost right at the beginning. But just to give you an overview of Frost's life, really, he was born in San Francisco in California, and he grew up in the city and attended Harvard and Dartmouth. These were the colleges that he went to, but he never really graduated. He was disillusioned very soon by this system, and in fact he took up odd jobs, and he also became a newspaper delivery person. He worked in the mills, he took up these odd jobs around him, because he realized that that's that kind of a college degree he did not aspire to get. And his earliest success, in fact, did not even happen in New England, that is in America, but in Europe. And in 1912, approaching almost when he was 40 years old, he had a few published poems. Frost decided to sail with his wife and his children to England and to relaunch his career then, because the kind of poetry that he was writing over there, which carried, you see, also one has to remember he is writing blank verse, but in a time when people have already moved to free verse. So the modern poets also are rejecting tradition. So Frost did not reject tradition outright, and which is also why he is often sometimes referred to as a conservative poet, you know, as somebody who's not been able to I think deal with or resolve his relationship with the past. Most of the 20th century writers have rejected past values along with the literary forms that were practiced, and whether they were in set rhymes. So Frost tried to join the old with the new, and he tried to use a form, the poetic forms. He used traditional forms, using, for instance, this kind of blank verse, and didn't want to write in free verse. In fact, he said that writing in free verse is like playing tennis without the net. So that's something that he said. So basically he said that you require you need to delimit and you need to know your frame in order to fit your verse into. So I think he was that kind of a poet. What do you think? What do you go for?
Well, he is a very quiet voice, and in that quiet voice, he can say things which really touch you.
Yeah, also witty.
Witty, very sense, witty, and yes. This is the wit of the countryside.
Yeah,
that you just compare something with this kind of absurdity that you play without the net. Right. But then he also has a deeper meaning in it. Right. That unless the net is there, you are not bound to any discipline, right. And you are supposed to be bound to principle of poetry, principles of prose, principles of language itself, right. And communicability.
But do you think binding yourself to a particular discipline is becoming traditional? Is he using? I mean, that's what a lot of critics really level their arguments against him, that he's not really a modern poet because he's using tradition. He's using a traditional form of poetry.
Actually, that kind of form is also used by some major poets of the 20th century and the modernists. I think Eliot also uses.
Yes,
Eliot
was very fond of using traditional forms. In fact, it was almost like trying to challenge the old writers to their game.
And Eliot used blank verse. He didn't use generally free verse.
Right.
He used, of course, the medieval free verse also, but that was different from the 20th century free verse. So that way, form actually does not impose a discipline unnecessarily on the content. And his content is wisdom, his content is experience,
right.
But his content is not pain, as you said in the beginning.
Also pain.
Also pain, but maybe of a quieter kind.
Yeah, no, I'll come to that bit, but because that is something that we don't generally associate Frost with. We associate, you're very right in saying that there is country wisdom there, there is experience wisdom that you get out of through your experiences, but also experiences that are as violent and the passions and so there is a modernish touch to him, but obviously because he is a part of a world where the world wars are taking shape, and this kind of indifference of capitalism also makes him go in his shell, but also reject that kind of life altogether. So I think these are some of the ways in which you can look at Frost. But Frost, as I said, did not really find a very ready audience, and his poetry was not received very well because he was still using the old form, but the content of his poetry related to the people. There was a lot of American dialect there, colloquial speech, the rhythms of speech captured even when he was using a traditional meter. So Frost published his first book of poetry titled A Boy's Will in 1913. And this was done in England when he had already sailed with his family and tried to see, he thought that England was more open to new writers, and so he thought he could start afresh there. And he was very right actually, because in England his works were received very well. His second collection, North of Boston, again was published while he was still away from America, and it carries some of the very popular poems such as Home Burial and After Apple Picking, Mending Walls. These are some of the poems that are often anthologized, and Frost gained fame with that. By the time he reached America, people already knew, there were reviews being written about out his works, and he had already gained some spot for himself. So once he comes back to America, he buys a farm for himself and family, and devotes his time wholeheartedly to writing poetry and publishing. Now it is also during this time when he also begins to give some lectures, because he needs to financially support the family. So he begins to give some lectures during this period in various universities and colleges. So this period sort of marks this kind of a this peak in his literary career. His poem Mending Walls, which I just mentioned, for instance, which is a part of North of Boston 1914 collection. Most of the poems of North of Boston, are seen as poems which terrify, which are poems which deal with darker aspects of life. Mending Walls is in fact one of those where the country wisdom is actually available, but again, I felt that Frost wasn't in favor of rigidity or tradition. In fact, he was trying to question the assumed ideas that we have, or assumed idioms that we often use. And he's questioning this assumed idea of good fences make good neighbors, right? And he says this is the idea harbored by his neighbor, who's meticulously trying to bring the wall, trying to fence their homes and their lawns. And he says that this is the idea that is harbored by the neighbor, but because he's unwilling to let go of old traditional ideas and the mindset, the rigid mindset of his father. So to quote this one passage from there, this stanza, he says, before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in and walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down, unquote. So you can see that the idea of mending walls is not to erect walls, rather to bring them down. And he says that something wants it down. And he says, what am I walling in and what am I walling out? This is a very, in fact, country wisdom. In fact, this is also shared by the Native Americans in America, because when the Americans set in and they tried to buy land from the tribals often said that, what are you trying to buy? That this land is neither yours nor mine. Who am I to sell something that I don't even own? And this land owns me, because one day I'm going to turn to dust and join it. So who am I to, walling in and walling out in a way suggests that you are trying to latch on to territories, you're trying to latch on to land, you're trying to possess it, while possession in itself is exclusion. So when you are walling, then you are walling in something and walling out something.
It's a great humanist consideration that all human beings are together and they are equal and all. And why raise a wall?
Yes.
And if you raise a wall, you are doing something wrong.
Yes, that's true. And we see, and the idea that we seem to take things for granted because there is an idiom or an aphorism that supports it.
Yes.
And then we don't question it, because it's like good fences make good neighbors. So point closed. And he seems to question this kind of an old traditional knowledge which is rigid, and he says which is a reflective of the rigid mindset of the earlier generation, but which we need to set right. So I found this again in fact a kind of a critique of tradition, rather than saying that he's a traditional poet. I thought that he was questioning the whole rigidity of tradition as well, and taking this forward. So 1915 is when Robert
critically
Frost,
aware and critically self-aware.
Self-aware, yes. Also that he understands the weakness of the neighbor, but at the same time is conscious of his own proclivities.
Yes.
So I think that is something that I found very interesting in Mending Walls. Then by the time he came to America in 1915, he was already gaining fame with Amy Lowell, who had reviewed his work, and especially the North of Boston, and it became a bestseller. So post this period, he continued to bring out collections of poetry, and Mountain Interval that came out in 1916 added to his fame, and there were other books that were added, other collections that he added. New Hampshire was one. In fact, it won him the Pulitzer Prize. He's actually the only poet that has won 4 Pulitzer prizes. So the other collections that won him three more Pulitzers. The first is, of course, New Hampshire. The others were A Further Range, A Witness Tree. These are some of his works that won him again Pulitzer Prizes. So, in fact, he wrote realistic verse which portrayed ordinary people in everyday situations. I think that is what also I think is to some extent the romantic. Carrying forward the romantic tradition, but also at the same time, not necessarily indulging in this kind of experience.
Do you see something is similar between him and Wordsworth, the old romantic poet who also talked about poor people and their simple ways?
I thought about this point, but in Wordsworth, there is a sense of centrality to nature, and the human being is, subject to its authority, and the human being gains nourishment from nature, etc. In Frost, the human being is in the center. Human being is at the center, and human being is the center of Frost poetry, where the human being has to tackle, tackle nature. Processes of nature and fight with nature to maintain its own space, right? So it's not something, so it's like, again, as I said, I use the word endurance, right? Now you have to withstand the forces of life and the forces of nature. So that's why I said there is no sentimentalism in Frost. There is no this kind of indulgence in this kind of nature poetry. While nature is sacred, yes, at the same time I feel that this nature has more to do with how human beings process the natural world around them, how human beings respond to and negotiate with the natural world around them. For instance, there was this poem that he wrote. It's again one of those dark poems of his, where he's talking about the country life. But this particular poem actually tells you how nature becomes a terrifying force also, in his poetry, because whether you take this out, or you take home burial, you realize that these poems in fact take the darker aspect of nature forward. And when you refer to these poems, then you realize there is a sense of loss, there is a kind of complexity, but there is also a sense of this tussle with nature, and one is never sure where what one's future is going to be, because it is very unpredictable, and violence and death then get evoked in this poem out and out. And and it's a scene, it's a very in fact it's a heartbreaking scene where you find that the circular saw, the bus saw is is projected to us in a kind of a farm, and there is a boy who's working on this circular saw that's going on and splintering wood with it. Now while he's doing that, this boy's hand gets cut off in the saw, and then and he finally dies in the poem. But the out is obviously a reference to, I mean, it is believed that it is taken from Shakespeare's Macbeth, where out brief candle, and it goes on, life's but a walking shadow, and a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. So you find that there is a sense of unpredictability and nature's onslaught on human beings, and nature is also the cycle of life and death. So because you are a part of nature, you're not outside nature. So so this kind of violence that is done in the countryside, where accidents happen all the time, and one just loses one's life. And I'll just quote this bit from the poem, just so maybe it becomes clear. It goes like, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out at the boy's hand and seemed to leap. He must have given the hand, however it was, neither refused the meeting. But the hand, the boy's first outcry, was a rueful laugh, as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. And then it goes for, I'm skipping some, and then towards the end. They listened at his heart, little less, nothing, and that ended it. No more to build on there, and they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs, unquote.
Well, there is a kind of torment, there is a
Yes.
kind of violence, as you rightly say, and yet that sense of calmness and tranquility at the same
Yes,
time.
that you must carry on, that you
Yes.
must carry with life. And so the ones who were not dead turned to their affairs, because there is a sense of life and death, which is, there is a kind of a stoic acceptance of death. Of course, we need to understand that Frost had many tragic experiences in his own life. Two of his children died when they were very young. One of his child had to seek therapy. So all those things, left a very deep impact on him, and the tragic strains in his poetry come from that phase of his life where he lost his child, and then the whole family's attempt to cope with this kind of loss. So I think this is one of the instances where you find that the aspect of life and death and nature itself proving to be not so conducive, or not necessarily a nurture and nurse to life. Again, there's another poem which is on the similar on similar lines, which is Storm Fear, where the storm is working towards, is building up, and is actually like the beast, and that is daring human beings to show up if they can. So while in Wordsworth there is a sense of nature as mother, nurturer, guide, also sublime because it can terrify, but it never really is violent towards human beings. In Frost, because of the experience with nature, you find that he understands the terrifying force that nature can become. And so in his poem Storm Fear, he actually says that the beast says, come out, come out. And there is a sense, there is the blizzard that he is talking about, and I quote, when the wind works against us in the dark and pelts the snow, the low chamber window on the east, and whispers with a sort of stifled bark, the beast, come out, come out. There is a sense that there is a beast out there to get you, and that is, he's referring to the storm, and that you must keep yourself in. And then he at another place says, how the cold creeps as the fire dies at length. So there is a sense that nature is not exactly a friend, mother, guide, as it was in nature. Just to answer that question of yours.
Yes. No, I think you're right, because perceptions of poets in the latter half of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century have changed, and nature is not as kind and as tranquilizing as it was in the case of Wordsworth. Wordsworth was not in fact exposed to the urban influences. He always kept himself to the lake districts and all.
Yes.
And Frost, is somewhere in the middle of it. Therefore, he has to accept nature as something that will give pain also.
Right.
You're right.
Right. Yes. So I think that's how I see at least one aspect of Frost's poetry as this, which is nature as terrifying, but nature also as a source of joy. There are those instances as well, and maybe we can take this forward when we join for another lecture on Frost.
Yes, so friends, Dr. Bajaj has talked about the poet Robert Frost in critical terms as well as realistic terms, and she defines his role as an interpreter, as a person who responds to the different aspects of life in his own world, and that he doesn't lose his cool, he always remains poised, he has that kind of sense of stability with him, and that in fact can be also expressed through the word wisdom. So we come to the first half of the discussion, and in the second half Dr. Bajaj will take other questions too, and particularly she mentioned it, and I would request her later to also talk about the living in the time of the two world wars, and what impact, because he lived through both the wars. He was there at the time of the First World War and Second World War, and there has to be some kind of a link between them. So I would be curious to know your views then in the second half of the lecture. So thank you.